Hello, my name is Hubert, and I'm the co-founder and president of Atlas Conservation Initiative. I recently completed my PhD at the University of Queensland on the illegal wildlife trade. My talk today is part of an ICCB 2021 symposium called Understanding Perspectives in the Illegal Wildlife Trade from Supply to Demand. So building on what the speakers before me in the symposium have discussed, I'll be focusing on the demand side of the illegal wildlife trade and why it's important to ensure that the needs and perspectives of stakeholders on the demand side of the equation are understood and considered in conservation decision-making. In particular, I'll be talking about the context of traditional Chinese medicine stakeholders. So very briefly, trade in wildlife is as old as recorded history itself. And today it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. All sorts of wildlife across the tree of life, from plants to animals and fungi, are traded around the world. Many species are traded. And just to give you an idea of the scale and reach, around a quarter of terrestrial vertebrates are involved in wildlife trade. Wildlife trade can be both sustainable and unsustainable. And the primary approach we rely on for governing wildlife trade today is through regulation. Regulation happens at different levels: national, regional, international. Individual countries will have their own laws on what can and cannot be traded. And at the international level, we have treaties like CITES to determine what can and cannot be traded and whether there are specific conditions that have to be met and followed. And so with regulation, we can have wildlife trade that is legal and wildlife trade that is illegal. So problems really arise when we have trade that is illegal or unsustainable, and especially when trade is in a specific species is both illegal and unsustainable. Illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade is currently putting 12,000 species at risk of extinction. The consequences involved are very complex and goes beyond threatening the survival of the species that are targeted and traded. There are impacts for non-target species and for ecosystem services. The very nature of illegal wildlife trade being illegal means that there are elements of criminality and criminal networks involved. There are impacts on local economies. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion over the past 2 years about the illegal wildlife trade and how wildlife trade is intricately linked to zoonotic diseases spilling over into humans and the major consequences for human health and global economy that follow. So when we think about the illegal wildlife trade chain, we can break down the actors involved as belonging to three broad categories: harvesters, intermediaries, and consumers. As with any other trade, the basic economics of supply and demand apply in the illegal wildlife trade. And consumer demand is an integral part of the system that arguably drives the entire trade chain. So given the scale and given the multifaceted consequences associated with illegal wildlife trade, it's very important to understand demand and influence consumers when trying to tackle illegal wildlife trade. And yet, the World Bank estimates that only 6% of the funds committed around the world to address illegal wildlife trade are focused on consumer demand. So this is an aspect that really needs greater focus and attention. If we look at consumer demand a little bit more closely, we start to consider the different motivations that drive wildlife use and wildlife consumption. People use wildlife and wildlife products for all sorts of reasons. For instance, people make guitars out of rosewood. Some people keep birds and snakes and different exotic pets. There are some functional motivations that include the consumption of wild game and the use of wildlife products in traditional medicine. Some materials like elephant ivory are turned into carvings and artwork that have substantial monetary value. And in some cultures, hunting might be a rite of passage. And so we have to look at the different ways and all the different reasons that people use wildlife. And we'll see that consumer motivations are as varied and as diverse as the species that are involved in the trade itself. Looking at the medicinal use of wildlife, we find that the use of plants, animals, and fungi for medicinal purposes stretches back into ancient history. Today, the World Health Organization estimates that as many as 80% of the world's 6 billion people rely primarily on animal and plant-based medicines. And so with so many people using wildlife and wildlife-derived products for medicine, there are real implications for ecology, for culture, for the preservation of traditional knowledge, for local and regional economies, and also for public health outcomes. On the slide, you'll see some examples of medicinal use of wildlife, really just as an illustration that this is a phenomenon that happens across the world and in all sorts of cultural settings. But of course, the focus of this talk is traditional Chinese medicine, so that's what I'll be focusing on for the rest of the talk. The history and roots of traditional Chinese medicine go back thousands of years and is widely used in China today, where it's officially practiced alongside Western biomedicine at every level of China's healthcare system. Outside of China, more and more people around the world are using traditional Chinese medicine as well, and the WHO added traditional Chinese medicine to its global diagnostic compendium in 2019. Now, while the medical traditions and practices of TCM have evolved over time, TCM today is still very much based on the philosophy of yin and yang, which is that everything in the universe is all about balance, and imbalances in the body is what manifests into illness. In a nutshell, good balance is good health. And so curing illnesses essentially means regaining and maintaining balance. How is this done? Well, pharmacotherapy is one of the main forms of treatment in traditional Chinese medicine. And this is where medicinal ingredients, each of which has a particular set of characteristics that help counterbalance issues in the body, are prepared or mixed in with other ingredients and consumed. This is where traditional Chinese medicine meets conservation, because a huge array and diversity of plants, animals, and fungi are used. Some of these, unfortunately, are threatened or endangered, and some are protected with trade restrictions. Some of these examples are well known, such as rhino horn. Others are less well known, like Coptis tita or Yunnan gold thread, which is a flowering plant endemic to a small area of China that's overcollected for use in TCM. Or there's Dendrobium officinale, a critically endangered orchid that's also used in traditional Chinese medicine. Now, what we want to do is move towards greater sustainability in how these ingredients are produced and used. And so when it comes to conservation measures, including trade restrictions and in some cases trade bans, the legitimacy of these strategies in the eyes of TCM stakeholder groups is of critical importance for effective conservation, whether it's in terms of policy uptake or compliance with regulations. And so this requires an understanding of TCM and engagement with these very important stakeholders. So which stakeholders in the TCM world should conservationists be engaging with? And where do they sit along the wildlife trade chain? There are, of course, your harvesters who produce all the various plant and animals and fungi products that are used in traditional Chinese medicine. Then, of course, you've got processors and pharmaceutical firms that in some instances transform the raw ingredients into retail products for the consumer. And the process for this ranges from simple processes like drying medicinal ingredients to producing highly processed, manufactured, patent medicine products. Then you have vendors, who we typically think of as intermediaries. In the TCM context, these would be herbalist shops and pharmacies, medical facilities like clinics or hospitals, and of course, traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, or what we'd be familiar with as doctors. However, these stakeholders play a bit of a dual role in the wildlife trade chain because they can, in many ways, influence and direct consumer demand through consultation and prescription. So in that sense, these stakeholders rather straddle both supply and demand and act somewhere between intermediaries and the end user. And so in addition to consumers, vendors in particular, when it comes to traditional Chinese medicine, are very important stakeholders to understand their motivations, their preferences, beliefs and practices, especially those in the private sector, because TCM practitioners and herbalist shops can dispense drugs to patients directly with very little administrative or regulatory oversight in China, as well as in many other countries. And finally, of course, the reasons why consumers use traditional Chinese medicine wildlife products and the contexts in which they use them are quite varied as well. TCM is very deeply ingrained in Chinese culture and identity, and wildlife products, including threatened species, are used in contexts as varied as everyday cooking and food, like the use of caterpillar fungus in high-end soups, to tonics and over-the-counter medicines that are aimed at improving body conditioning or improving overall health, to treatments prescribed by TCM practitioners that are used to treat illnesses or that are consumed in conjunction with Western biomedicine. For instance, herbal decoctions that a cancer patient might take to counteract some of the side effects of chemotherapy. And of course, consumers can find new ways of using TCM products too. Uses are certainly not set in stone and can evolve over time. For instance, jiao, which is made from donkey hides, was traditionally used for issues with the blood, but its uses have expanded somewhat and can now be found in face creams and ointments and other folk remedies. And so it goes without saying that understanding and engaging with consumers is really critical for conservation. Ultimately, I think it would be potentially pretty futile to tackle, I guess, TCM by saying things like it doesn't work or it isn't scientific, because we end up alienating important stakeholders for whom TCM is a big part of their lives and their personal and even cultural identity. From my interactions with TCM stakeholders, I've really come to think that TCM isn't fundamentally at odds with conservation, and folks will tell you that a core tenet of TCM's philosophy is harmony with nature and the importance of nature. And people do tend to recognize that it's best if TCM products are used in a sustainable way, perhaps not only because of ecological reasons, but because it impacts the development of TCM. And that's really a point of common, I guess, value that conservation and conservationists can latch onto and work together with TCM stakeholders to find ways of making sure that wildlife trade is conducted sustainably and to find legal pathways for sustainable trade to be possible. Pluralism is something that's possible, and recognizing the cultural significance of traditional Chinese medicine and getting a working knowledge of it will only allow conservationists to find solutions that are contextually and culturally appropriate in order for these solutions to work for both TCM stakeholders and to improve biodiversity outcomes. Thank you very much.